I never told my husband I owned the building, not the catering kitchen, not the commercial lease, not the 2 rental units above it. When he asked me what I did for work, I said I ran a small food business, which was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. People ask me now if I feel guilty about that. I don't. And I'll tell you exactly why before this is over. My name is Sylvette, and before you ask, no, that's not a name I made up. My mother was from Louisiana, and she had opinions about names. I'm 63 years old. I've been a widow for 11 years, and for 11 of those years, I built something that was entirely mine. My husband Gerald, my first husband, the one I loved, died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October. He was 54. He was eating cereal at the kitchen table. I was in the shower. By the time I came downstairs in my robe with wet hair, he was gone. I won't spend too long on that part because the story isn't about grief, but I need you to understand what those first 2 years look like because they matter. I had 2 adult children, a mortgage I couldn't cover alone, and a part-time bookkeeping job that paid me barely enough to keep the lights on. Gerald had been the earner. I had been the organizer, the planner, the one who kept the household running. And when he died, I discovered that being good at running a household does not automatically translate to financial stability. I sold the house. I moved into a small rental. I told myself this was temporary. What actually happened was that I started cooking. I had always cooked. Gerald used to say I could make a Tuesday night feel like a dinner party. After he died, cooking was the one thing that didn't feel hollow. I started making food for neighbors, then for a church fundraiser, then for a church fundraiser, then for a colleague's retirement party. Someone asked if I was available for hire. I said yes before I'd even thought it through. That was 11 years ago. By the time I was 58, I owned a licensed commercial catering kitchen in a building I bought at auction 6 years prior. The 2 apartments above the kitchen, one rented to a nursing student, one to a retired school teacher, covered my mortgage and then some. The catering business itself had a steady client list, corporate lunches, memorial receptions, birthday parties, the occasional wedding. I had 2 part-time employees I trusted completely. I kept a separate business account, a separate LLC, and a lawyer named Deborah who had been keeping my paperwork airtight since year 3. I wasn't wealthy, but I was stable in a way I had built myself from nothing after the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And I was proud of that in a way I didn't entirely know how to explain to people. Which is maybe why, when I met my second husband, I didn't lead with any of it. I met him at my cousin's 4th of July barbecue. His name was Roger. He was 61, recently retired from a regional insurance company, divorced. He said it had been amicable, said they'd just grown apart, said she had moved closer to her sister in Phoenix. He was tall, easy to talk to, laughed at his own jokes in a way that was more charming than it sounds. He brought a very good potato salad to the party, and that honestly went a long way with me. We talked for 3 hours on my cousin's back porch while the kids played in the yard and the sun went down. He asked me about my family, about my late husband, about my kids. I asked him about his retirement, his daughter, who lived 2 states away, his plans for this next chapter. He said he wanted to travel more. He said he was looking for a slower pace. He seemed content, settled. When he asked what I did, I told him I ran a small food business. He said that sounded wonderful, asked if I enjoyed it. I said I did. He didn't push further, and I didn't offer more. It wasn't a lie. It was just incomplete. We dated for 8 months. He was attentive, patient, considerate. He remembered small things. He showed up when he said he would. My daughter liked him. My son was cautious but polite. My friend Odette, who had known me since we were 26, said he seemed solid. Before I agreed to marry him, I did something I want every woman reading this to hear clearly. I hired a private investigator. I want to say that again. I hired a private investigator before I said yes. Not because I thought he was hiding something, not because anything had set off alarm bells, I did it because I had spent 6 years building financial security from scratch, and I had made a promise to myself after Gerald died that I would never again be in a position where someone else's absence or presence could undo everything I had worked for. I did it because I was 62 years old and I had earned the right to be careful. The report came back clean. No significant debt, no criminal record, no outstanding lawsuits. His divorce had been finalized 4 years prior. His financial history was unremarkable in the best possible way. Modest, steady, no red flags. I still called Deborah. I told her I was thinking about getting married. She said, "Great, let's talk prenup." We did. It wasn't a difficult conversation. The prenup was specific. My business, the building, the rental income, and all assets I had brought into the marriage remained mine and mine alone. His retirement pension and savings remained his. Anything we built together going forward would be handled jointly. Deborah had seen enough late-life marriages go sideways that she drafted it without a single raised eyebrow. I told Roger I wanted a prenuptial agreement before we got engaged. I expected it to be an awkward conversation. It wasn't. He said he thought that was completely reasonable. Signed without complaint, and we went out for dinner afterward. I remember thinking, this is a good sign. We got married in April. Small ceremony, backyard of my cousin's house, the same place we'd met. 40 people, food I had catered myself, my daughter as my maid of honor. It was a genuinely happy day. For the first 4 months, everything was fine. Roger moved into my house. He was tidy. He cooked breakfast on weekends. He was kind to my rental tenants when he ran into them. He didn't interfere in the business. He asked occasionally how things were going, and I gave him general answers. Busy season, a big corporate contract, new venue I was auditioning. He seemed interested without being intrusive. Then his daughter came to visit. Her name was Tiffany. She was 38, worked in real estate development, and arrived with an energy I can only describe as accessorial. She looked at my house the way someone looks at a property listing. She asked questions that seemed casual but landed differently in my chest. "So you own this house outright? What's the neighborhood been doing value-wise? Do you own any other properties or just this one?" I answered the last one honestly. "Just this one," I said, and smiled. Which was technically true. I own my house. The commercial property is held in my LLC, not in my personal name. She nodded slowly, like she was filing something away. Over dinner, she asked Roger about his plans now that he was retired. He said he was enjoying the slower pace. She said she had a development opportunity she'd been wanting to talk to him about, something in a neighboring county. She needed a silent investor for the first phase. She described it in the comfortable language of someone who has pitched this particular thing more than once. Roger said he'd think about it. I said nothing. I watched. After she left, I asked Roger if she had approached him about investing before. He paused a beat too long before he said no. Then he said, "Well, once a while back, but nothing serious." I went back to Deborah the following week. Not in a panic, just checking in, making sure everything was still properly documented. She pulled up my LLC structure, looked at the property deed, confirmed the prenup was filed. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. "You've got nothing to worry about," Deborah said. "Legally, your assets are completely separated." "I know," I said. "I'd just like to hear it." The pressure shifted slowly over the next few months. It started with Roger asking more specific questions about the business, not hostile, not demanding, just more specific than before. How many clients did I have on retainer? Was the commercial kitchen lease to own, or did I own it outright? Had I ever thought about expanding, maybe bringing in a partner? I answered some questions and deflected others. I said the kitchen situation was complicated. I said I was happy with the current size. I said I wasn't looking for partners. Then one evening, he sat me down and said Tiffany's development project had a window that was closing. She needed an answer. He had been thinking about using some of his pension savings to invest, not a large amount, but enough to get a stake in the first phase. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to put in some capital too. Not from the business, he said, just whatever I had accessible. I asked him what whatever I had accessible meant. He said he didn't know what my financial situation looked like in detail. He said we'd been married 8 months and he didn't really have a clear picture of what I had and what I didn't. He said he wasn't trying to pry. He was just, as a married couple, he thought it might be time for more transparency. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I'm not in a position to invest in a development project right now. He looked at me. What does that mean? It means I'm not doing it, I said. And I'd be careful with your pension, too. Real estate development carries a lot of risk. He didn't like that answer. The conversation ended, and we didn't revisit it that night. But something had shifted. I felt it the next morning at the breakfast table, and the morning after that. A new kind of quiet had settled into the house. Not comfortable quiet, not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that has questions underneath it. Tiffany called the house twice over the following 2 weeks. The first time I answered, she was friendly, breezy, asked how I was settling into married life. The second time, she asked if she could come visit again, said she had some paperwork for her dad and wanted to drop it off personally. I said, of course, and then I called my daughter and asked her to be at the house the afternoon Tiffany arrived. I also, before that visit, made sure every piece of business documentation in my home office was in my car. Tiffany came on a Saturday. She brought pastries. She was pleasant. She hugged me at the door. The paperwork she brought Roger turned out to be an investment summary for the development project. Glossy, professionally printed, like something a financial firm would produce. She walked him through it at the kitchen table while I made coffee. Then she looked up at me and said, I was actually hoping to talk to both of you. Combining resources is really where the leverage comes from. Even a smaller contribution from your side could make a real difference in the first phase capital. My daughter was sitting in the corner of the living room, close enough to hear. I sat down at the table. I put my coffee down. I looked at Tiffany directly and I said, I appreciate the presentation. I'm not interested in investing, and I want to be clear that I'm also not going to be pressured into a conversation about what my financial resources look like. Tiffany blinked. Then she smiled, that tight smile that lives in the space between anger and composure. She said, I'm not trying to pressure anyone. I'm just saying, as a family. We're not that kind of family yet, I said. We've been married 8 months. There was silence. Roger was looking at the table. My daughter was looking at her phone, but she wasn't typing anything. Tiffany left an hour later. That night, after my daughter had gone home, Roger told me he felt embarrassed. He said I had been rude. He said Tiffany was his daughter and she deserved respect, and that I had made her feel unwelcome in our home. I said, your daughter came to our home to ask me to fund her development project. I don't think she's the one who should feel put out. He said she was just trying to include us as a family. I said, Roger, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly. Before we got married, did you know about this investment project? Is that what slower pace meant? You were planning to find capital? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, she mentioned it. I didn't think it would be a big deal. You run a business. I thought you might have liquidity. I heard that sentence land in my body like a stone dropping into still water. He hadn't married me despite not knowing my finances. He had married me because he assumed I had money he could access. I want to be very clear. I don't know with absolute certainty that this was his primary motivation, but I know that I heard what he said and I understood what it meant. He had assumed, based on the house, based on the catering business, based on whatever he had pieced together, that I had capital available. And he had married me, at least in part, with that assumption. I went to Deborah's office on Monday morning. She already knew something was coming. When you've been someone's lawyer for long enough, you learn to read the way they walk through your door. She had the prenup pulled up on her screen before I sat down. It's clean, she said. You want me to start separation paperwork, I said. Not yet. I want to understand every option. We talked for 2 hours. She walked me through what a separation would look like, what a divorce would look like, what my exposure was. The answer, because of the prenup and the LLC structure, was minimal. My building, my business, my rental income, none of it was marital property. His pension was his. The joint account we'd opened together had about 4 months of household expenses in it, which we would split. I was protected, completely and entirely. I had known I was protected. But sitting in that office and hearing it laid out clearly, I felt something release in my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I went home that evening and I told Roger I wanted to talk. I told him I knew why he'd asked me about liquidity. I told him I knew what he'd been assuming about my finances. I told him I wasn't angry, I was tired, and I was clear-eyed, and I had made my decision. I told him I thought he was a decent man in some ways, that I didn't think he was a monster, but that he had married me with a calculation I hadn't agreed to, and I wasn't willing to stay in a marriage built on that. He tried to backtrack. He said I was misreading it. He said he loved me. He said Tiffany had put too much pressure on him and he hadn't handled it well. I said, I believe that's partly true, but I also know what you said, and I'm a woman who has learned to trust what she knows. He left 2 weeks later. The divorce was uncontested and final in 4 months. Tiffany was apparently furious. Deborah told me she'd had her own lawyers send a letter suggesting I had misrepresented my assets during courtship, which made Deborah laugh out loud. The prenup was ironclad. There was nothing to contest. My tenants upstairs brought me a casserole the week the divorce was finalized. My daughter came and stayed for the weekend. Odette came over with wine and we sat in my kitchen until midnight, and I didn't cry once. People ask me if I regret marrying him. Honestly, not much. I learned something about myself that I might not have learned any other way, that I had built something real enough that someone thought it was worth scheming for. That's a strange thing to feel proud of, but I do. I also learned that the instinct I had to keep my business to myself, to keep the structure of what I owned separate and documented and protected, wasn't paranoia. It was wisdom. I had treated my future self as someone worth protecting, and she was. If you're a woman who has built something on your own, after loss, after hard years, after starting over, please hear me when I say this. The prenup is not unromantic. The LLC is not cynical. The lawyer is not pessimistic. They are the way you protect the version of yourself that survived everything and got back up. I still run my catering business. I still have my 2 tenants upstairs. My nursing student graduated and moved out last spring. I found a new tenant, a young woman studying physical therapy who smells like lavender and always pays early. My school teacher has been there 7 years, and I hope she stays forever. I still cook on Sunday mornings. I still think Gerald would have loved this kitchen. I am 63 years old. I own what I own. I worked for everything I have, and I am not ashamed that I protected it. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that marriage. Not the legal part. Deborah handled that cleanly, and I never lost a thing. I mean what happened underneath it. What I learned about people, about myself, about what it costs to build something, and what it takes to keep it. Roger wasn't a villain. I want to be honest about that. He was a man who had made assumptions, let his daughter lead him somewhere he shouldn't have gone, and when the moment came to be straightforward with me, he wasn't. That's not nothing. But it's also not the kind of evil that makes a good story. It was ordinary, quiet greed dressed up as family togetherness. And I think that's actually the more important thing to name, because ordinary is what most people encounter, not the dramatic con artist. Just someone who saw what you had and thought they deserved access to it. What I keep coming back to is this. Roger's plan, if you can call it that, only worked if I hadn't already protected myself. Every single move he and Tiffany made required me to be unprepared. The investment pitch, the questions about liquidity, the slow pressure to reveal what I owned, all of it assumed that I had done nothing, that I was walking into a second marriage the same way I'd walked into everything else in my life before I learned better. I wasn't. And that's the whole story, really. There's a version of Sylvette who doesn't call the lawyer before the engagement, who thinks a prenup feels unromantic and skips it, who answers Tiffany's questions over dinner without realizing what they were actually asking, who shares the bank statements, the property deed, the LLC paperwork, because she's trying to show she has nothing to hide. That version of me would have been picked clean inside 2 years. And she would have lost not just money, she would have lost everything she had rebuilt from the hardest years of her life. I didn't become careful because I'm suspicious by nature. I became careful because I watched what carelessness cost me when Gerald died, not because of anything he did wrong, but simply because we hadn't planned for the unexpected. I made a promise to myself in that rental apartment with its thin walls and 2 quiet evenings. I would never again let the future me be undefended. I would treat her like she mattered, like she had earned protection, because she had. That's what I'd want any woman to take from this. Not that men are dangerous, not that love is a trap, just that wisdom is not the enemy of warmth. You can love openly and still structure your assets carefully. You can give someone your time, your presence, your genuine affection, and still keep your building in an LLC. Those things are not in conflict. Anyone who tells you they are is probably someone who wants access to what you've protected. The character you build over decades, the discipline to show up when you're grieving, the courage to start over at 50, the steadiness to keep going when the business is slow and the accounts are thin, that character is worth guarding. Not out of fear, out of respect for everything it took to become who you are. I am 63. I run my business. I own my building. I know who I am, and I will not apologize for protecting her.